Welcome, everyone. We're only picking up really the second theme this evening. Last time, having looked at the politicization and sectarianization of God, we want to look at the partition of Ireland and the formation of confessional states this evening, as we try to explore whether or not we have reached the end of religious nationalism here or wherever. I suppose in some ways, Ireland is a case study in religious nationalism. At least that is true historically, whatever judgments we make about present day Ireland. Orange and green nationalisms have dominated modern Irish history, and religion has been inseparable from these nationalisms. And this was true of much of the modern Western world. We lived within Christendom, the marriage of church and state that began in the 4th century. Christian foundations were shaken by the Protestant Reformation, so Protestantism continued in its Christendom mode. And it was not really, I suppose, until the French Revolution in 1789 that the foundations really began to crumble. World War I was the catastrophic war that ended Christendom. Europe began its 20th century journey into the secular, with not only Christianity being marginalized and deprivileged, but the separation of church and state became a reality. It took a bit longer for Christendom to collapse in Ireland and to separate church and state. But this is now the reality in the Catholic South and the Protestant North. It's not where we were 100 years ago, but in only a century, it is where we are now. Where will we be in 2122? I'm not sure that my Methodist tradition will be around, but that will not be the end of the world, as the end of Christendom is not the end of the world. The end of the world and the end of an historical era are not the same thing, though the trauma and dislocation we experience may make it feel that it is the end. There is nothing inevitable about history, except that it moves and it moves on. The truth in Darwin's theory of evolution is not the survival of the fittest and that only the strong survive. That is a misunderstanding. Darwin's truth was that only those species which adapt survive. So adaptation is key to the future. What all this means for religious nationalism is a big question. Has it come to an end? The reality of the secular ought to bring us to the end of religious nationalism, yet there is a resurgence of nationalism, even aggressive nationalism in parts of the world. It might be aggressive secular nationalism that we now have, and yet there is also resurgent religion and global politics, and not all nationalism is religion-free. Religion aligned with political power not only lingers, it seems to be roaring back in some cases, not necessarily for the good, and certainly not common good. A few years ago, I attended a European Churches conference in Romania. The small Romanian city was called Sibiu. That wasn't its only name. Some called it Sibiu, and others referred to it as Hermannstadt. The city identity was contested with roots in history. I suppose it was their version of Derry, Londonderry. It's not as serious, but there are so many Russians living and owning property and business in London that sometimes the city is referred to as Londongrad. Well, Sibiu or Hermannstadt, like Derry, Londonderry, is rooted in a politics of history and a politics of identity. Sibiu is in Transylvania, a region where borders have been drawn and redrawn a number of times. On one of the evenings, we attended Vespers in the Romanian Orthodox Cathedral. Now, the unaccompanied singing of an Orthodox choir was deeply moving. You had this deep sense of the mysterium tremendum, transcendence and otherness. And yet we stood in a large building draped in Romanian flags. and also got a real sense of the expression of liturgy being closely entwined with Romanian nationalism. To be Orthodox was to be Romanian, and to be Romanian was to be Orthodox. But where did that leave the other people of Transylvania who were ethnically Hungarian and who belonged to the Hungarian Reformed tradition, the Christian tradition of John Calvin? Some Reformed young people from Sibiu or Hermannstadt turned up at the church's conference, but security refused them entry and even threatened them with prison. In Ireland, we have had our tensions between Catholic and Protestant. In Romania, it was tensions and at times violence between Orthodox and Protestant, and the latter were not real Romanians. Romanian nationalism and Romanian orthodoxy were inseparable, and that socially, politically, and culturally, and even economically excluded the ethnic and Protestant Reformed Hungarians who had lived for a long time in Romania. Religious nationalism in Romania is expressed through the Russian Orthodox Christian tradition. Resurgent nationalism in India is entwined with the Hindu religion. The current Indian leader Modi is involved with a religio-political movement in India called Hindutva, a philosophy or ideology that is transforming India into a Hindu state, or at least a state with a distinctive Hindu identity. India's constitution is secular and pluralistic, but not for Modi, it seems, and his political party. India's population is majority Hindu. That is how the country was left in 1947 after partition, leaving the other partitioned and new country of Pakistan a Muslim state. India was for Hindus, the majority, though there were minorities of Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians. A secular constitution protected everyone, and yet it was under that secular constitution that Modi's party came to power, and with Modi, the party has a parliamentary majority it has never had before. It is the first governing party in the history of independent India to take power without a single elected Muslim member. And for the first time in Indian democracy, the top three constitutional positions, president, vice president, and prime minister, are all held by people of the same Hindutva ideology. India is now a classic example of religious nationalism. And as we know all too well and tragically, this is the politics of division and violence. Shashi Tharoor, in his fine book, Why I Am a Hindu, is unsparing in his criticism of Hindutva as an extremist nationalist Hinduism being pursued by Modi and India's government. Hinduism, Tharoor believes, is essentially pluralist in everything, a religion that recognizes uncertainty and pragmatic non-dogmatism. It is a religion of maybe he does not know, and therefore a religion that looks beyond the simplistic black and whites and grim certitudes of lesser mortals. The religious nationalism of Modi and his ruling party is, like all religious nationalism, a misuse and abuse of religion. As Tharoor writes, the misuse of religion for political purposes is, of course, a sad, sometimes tragic aspect of our contemporary reality. As then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once said, the problem is never with the faith, but with the faithful. All faiths strive sincerely to animate the divine spark in each of us, but some of their followers, alas, use their faith as a club to beat others with, rather than a platform to raise themselves to the heavens. And Tharoor continues, since Hinduism believes that there are various ways of reaching the ultimate truth, as a Hindu, I fully accept the belief systems of others as equal to my own. That is why I cannot and do not accept the Hindutva fanatics' interpretation of the values and principles of my faith. Whether we stand in a faith tradition or a secular tradition, how far does Thoreau's criticism of the dominating religious nationalism of his country and his openness and practice of religious or belief pluralism, how much does it resonate with us? Was Kofi Annan right that the problem was never with the faith, but with the faithful? Was that the problem in our modern Irish history? Or is that an avoidance of an inherent problem with faith and belief systems, religious or secular? How far did we go along with the orange and green religious nationalisms? And how uncritical have we been? Or have we just accepted what our religious traditions taught us and the example our religious leaders gave us? Was religious nationalism at the heart of Irish Catholic and Protestant faith? And did modern Irish history distort our religious traditions and politics from the start? Did Christendom give us a club to beat others? The religious nationalisms of Romania and India, one Christian, the other Hindu, perhaps provide a lens to view our own versions of religious nationalism. Romania and India might help us to critically view our history and even help us to move beyond our narrow sectarian religious fundamentalisms to greater democracy and freedom and to a more liberated and open public faith. Well, let's go into groups. There are a couple of questions. I think hopefully all of you did receive a kind of resource sheet for the evening. I did see a question come up on the chat. Was Kofi Annan right that the problem was never with the faith, but with the faithful? And was religious nationalism at the heart of Irish Catholic and Protestant faith? And did modern Irish history distort our religious traditions and politics from the very start? See where we go with that in 20 minutes conversation. Let's look at building confessional states and confessional foundations and see where that might take us. And after this bit of input, we can have a plenary session when we have an open discussion. But the 21st of May 1921 is one date given for the formation of Northern Ireland. The 6th of December 1922 is the date for the formation of the Free State as it was then known. Now, the partition of Ireland, like partition elsewhere, such as the partition of India in 1947, came about with much brutal violence and killing. The violence in Cork and West Cork was bad, but it was much worse in Belfast. There are those who will want maybe to deny it, but there was a significant sectarian dimension to the violence in Cork, West Cork, and Belfast. Sectarianism is a religio-political expression of attitudes, behaviours, systems, and structures that dominate, exclude, demonise, and eliminate. And sectarianism is not peculiar to Ireland. European history, certainly since the 16th century, was sectarian. And after the Reformations, Protestant and Catholic had shaped new religious and political systems and structures. Europe fought a most bloody 30 years war, which was both religious and political. The shaping of European imperialism in the 15th to the 17th centuries was sectarian in the struggle for supremacy and power on a global scale. The Portuguese and Spanish empires were Catholic, the British and the Dutch empires were Protestant, and the religious dynamics of expansionism and power over mattered. The Tudor invasion of Ireland in the 16th century introduced the Anglican model of the Protestant reformations to Ireland, followed a century later by plantation of the northeast of Ireland and the large numbers of mainly Scots Presbyterians in Ulster, the reformed model of the Protestant reformations and the theology of John Calvin. Now, by the end of the 19th century in Ireland, with much sectarian violence and bloodshed along the way, We had two religio-political and cultural equations set in stone. Catholic equals nationalist equals Gaelic. The other was Protestant equals Unionist equals British. There were those who didn't fit either equation. We might call them dissenting Catholics and dissenting Protestants, but they were minorities. Beyond these minorities, there were even fewer atheists or people without religious adherence. Irish people were religious, and their religion, it seemed, was one with their national and cultural identities. And the whole point of being one or the other was a thoroughly win-lose struggle, and guns and violence were becoming integral to the equations. There was nothing surprising about violence and partition. The partitioning of lands and peoples is not, and seems never to be, a peaceful business. And when you have set in stone equations that are a potent mix of religion and politics and culture, there not only is violence and bloodshed, the political entities formed out of the violence tend to be confessional. The British withdrew from India, allowing the Indian subcontinent to partition into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. They partitioned Ireland into a Catholic south and a Protestant north. The border was drawn where the border was drawn, on a sectarian head count, where it would establish an untouchable, so they then thought, Protestant majority, and therefore a Protestant state. It would be and remain British. And even though the British Empire had the largest number of Muslims within its global reach, it was described as a Protestant empire, and the Bible was the secret of England's greatness. The Protestant Catholic ratio in Northern Ireland in 1921 was 66 to 33%. In 1926, Catholics were 92.6% of the Free State population, with a very small Protestant population, which had been in decline since the mid-19th century. Was it any surprise that we ended up with confessional states, which were strong expressions of religious nationalism? In 1934, James Craig, the first Northern Ireland Prime Minister, said that he was an Orangeman first and a politician and an MP afterwards. And most, if not all, of his cabinet would have made the same claim. All I boast, he says, is that we are a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state. But then Craig's claim was in response to De Valera's claim in 1931 that he was a Catholic first. Perhaps 4 centuries of sectarian history had cast them as leaders of confessional states, one Catholic and the other Protestant. But the confessionalism was in the making long before 1921, 1922. Christendom, the marriage of church and state, throne and altar, had been buried in the mud and blood of the trenches of World War I. The religion and politics of this island had not yet realised that. Christendom would come into its own in both parts of Ireland. It is difficult to find church leaders at this time with an awareness that Christendom was dead or dying and that the church-state marriage was over. Let's not be too judgmental. It wasn't realised by a lot of European church leaders or people for a number of decades, and some, including political leaders, think the marriage is still not over. The confessionalism was more than visible at certain public events. In 1932, the World Eucharistic Congress was held in Dublin's Phoenix Park. The Congress was also marking the 1500th anniversary of St. Patrick's mission to Ireland. The former established state church, the Church of Ireland, also held a celebratory event claiming Patrick for itself. They were the true patrician church. Meanwhile, 1 million people attended the final mass in Phoenix Park. The papal legate was the chief celebrant, having been welcomed on arrival at Dún Laoghaire by 5,000 school children, by Catholic leaders, and welcomed in Irish and Latin by the President of the Executive Council, De Valera. The other members of the executive, the government, greeted the legate. After Mass, the sacrament processed off to the city centre, followed by cardinals and archbishops and bishops, then members of the Dáil and Senate and members of Dublin Corporation. It was a massive church-state occasion. 5 years later, De Valera produced a constitution with a profoundly religious Trinitarian and Christological preamble. The Catholic Church was given a special position, which was not removed by referendum until 1972. The Constitution embodied Catholic social teaching. The Catholic Church dominated the social practice and morality of the state. The Catholic Church shaped the moral life of the nation. Perhaps the last hurrah of dominance and control was in 1950, when the health minister announced the Mother and Child Scheme to offer welfare support to large numbers of struggling families. The Church successfully opposed, believing that the scheme would encroach on the charitable sphere of the Church. Doctors too fiercely opposed the scheme, fearing the loss of private practice. By the end of the 60s, the power, dominance and role of the Catholic Church was slipping and continued to slip, accelerated by abuse scandals and child trafficking from Catholic institutions, the Magdalene laundries, the damning inquiries. When the referendum in 2018 voted stunningly and overwhelmingly to legalise abortion, the confessional era was over for the Catholic Church, and the separation of church and state was complete. In the Northeast in 1912, the unionism God and guns that was embodied in the Ulster Covenant were approved by the Protestant churches. It was clear also from the statements made by Protestant churches during the Home Rule crisis that Protestant theology was state theology and civil religion. The Protestant churches were bitterly opposed to Home Rule, and then they accepted Home Rule in a partitioned Ireland. By 1922, they were adamant that there would be no partition of the churches. Accepting and supporting the formation of the new Northern Ireland, satisfied that their members would remain in the British state and empire, and so content with being in their own Protestant state, the Protestant churches signed over their schools to the new state system. They did, though, negotiate a key role in school management, including the selection and employment of teachers. Retaining a large control over education, they then set about looking for key roles within the new teacher training college, Stranmillis. Education was at the forefront of Protestant churches' concern. By 1925, Northern Ireland had a state education system that was Protestant. Teaching was required to teach, quote, a programme of simple Bible instruction. The Bible, so central to the Protestant churches, was at the heart of religious instruction in state Protestant schools. And with Protestant clergy so dominant in school management, and with a say in the appointment of teachers, it would be difficult for someone not a Protestant to be appointed a teacher. The Protestant churches have continued to influence and shape the religious curriculum. It is still a confessional curriculum, not allowing much focus on teaching children and young people about world religions and other philosophies of life. The primary school curriculum in the state school has recently been declared unlawful by the High Court as being too confessional, not objective, and narrow. The Protestant churches may well remain reluctant or unwilling to allow the curriculum to be designed or redesigned by other educationalists other than the church. By 1932, the Protestant churches had 3 representatives on the management of Stranmillis College. State education was to have a powerful role of the Protestant churches and clergy. It was perhaps not insignificant that the new Northern Ireland Parliament met from 1921 to 1932 in the Belfast Theological College of the Presbyterian Church. A very sensitive issue at the time was whether or not alcohol would be allowed in the parliamentary area. It may not have been an accident that 2 weeks before King George V opened the Northern Ireland Parliament, the Presbyterian General Assembly produced and discussed a programme of social reform. It looked very much like a programme for government. And undoubtedly the Presbyterians, the largest church in Northern Ireland, hoped to influence the new Parliament. And top of the list of reforms was education. Now, the Catholic Church did not allow priests to accept political office, but the Protestant churches had no such rules. And this is why a number of Protestant clergy have been elected as unionist politicians. The Reverend William Corky, a Presbyterian, was in fact the Minister for Education at one stage, and a strong opponent of non-denominational education being proposed by the first Minister for Education in Northern Ireland, Lord Londonderry. Corky was also the strongest advocate of Bible-based religious education. The Reverend James Little, another Presbyterian, was elected in 1939 to Westminster at age 71 as an independent unionist, advocating that Irish unity was a price worth paying if it brought the Free State into the war. In the 1970s and early 80s, the Reverend Robert Bradford, a Methodist, was MP at Westminster, a member of Vanguard Unionist, and gunned down by the IRA in his constituency office. The Reverend Martin Smith was for many years a Unionist MP at Westminster. The Reverend Robert Coulter, another Presbyterian and MLA at Stormont. And the Reverend Ian Paisley, perpetual moderator of the Free Presbyterian Church of Ulster, was the more than dominant figure in Northern Ireland politics for over 50 years. And all of these clergy, allowed at the time by their churches to have political roles, were in a sense religious nationalists. Paisley especially embodied a strong religious nationalism. Protestants were the chosen people in their promised land, and God was on their side, their help in ages past and hope for years to come. And the enemies of unionism were the enemies of God, and Northern Ireland was not only exceptional, its history, its struggle against enemies and continuing future was viewed in apocalyptic terms. Ulster's battle was no less than cosmic. Confessional states kept a religious nationalism alive. But does it still live? Why now a secular Ireland, as well as a multicultural, multi-religious Ireland? Will traditional Catholicism survive in the Republic of Ireland? What will unionism look like when its supporters are no longer uncomplicatedly Protestant? Can unionist politics survive the move away from Protestant religious nationalism? Maybe there is another critical judgment we need to acknowledge as we assess the confession of states and the temperature of religious nationalism. Crawford Gibbon of Queen's University, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, puts it this way: to the extent that the Catholic and Protestant churches attempted to dominate and control the peoples of the island, they undermined the Christian faith.